Thank you everyone who's joining. We're going to give it just a couple minutes. I think we opened the webinar and participants are joining now. So we'll start in probably just 1 or 2 minutes. Thank you for joining today. Hi, everyone. For everyone who's just joined, we're giving it just a minute or so, and then we'll get started, just letting participants an opportunity to get through the Zoom link and everything. We'll start soon. All right, we'll get started. I think more people may be coming in, but we'll get started. The webinar is also going to be recorded, which we'll send at after the recording is finished, after the webinar, so everyone can reference it at a later time. Welcome. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Kugazaki. I'm an attorney and pro bono director at Inland Counties Legal Services, along with Kayla Henderson, who is also here. We run ICLS's Small Business Legal Clinic. Our Small Business Legal Clinic has a mission to help small business owners and entrepreneurs in Riverside and San Bernardino counties, and we provide free legal information and legal services. This webinar is part of our program. In addition to webinars, we also offer one-on-one free legal guidance to small business owners and entrepreneurs who are eligible. At some point during this webinar, we will circulate, or it might be after the webinar, we will circulate our application for anyone who's interested in applying for more extended services. So let's get started. I'm very excited to provide this webinar today. It's called Small Business Essentials, Entity Selection and Formation Guidance for Small Businesses. As we probably all know, this is one of the most critical topics for all small business owners to consider. Every small business will probably want to consider what type of business entity is the most appropriate for the business that you're trying to run. There are a lot of legal implications on the entity type. Some entities provide better protection against liability. Some of them have a lot of different compliance requirements. So it's a critical question for everyone to consider. We're not here to say that everyone should be an LLC or everyone should be an S Corp or a certain specific type of formal entity. We're here to provide information to better inform you so that you can make that decision for yourself. And possibly, if you're interested for more guidance, apply to attend one of our one-on-one virtual consultations. The first slide I'm going to cover right now is a legal disclaimer. As I mentioned, this is a webinar to provide free legal information. No one at the webinar today, including Terrence D'Souza, who I'll introduce shortly, is giving legal advice. We can go to the next slide. The webinar is going to cover the following. We're going to introduce the speakers shortly, or the speaker, Terrence D'Souza, shortly. We'll get into talking about ICLS. We'll also talk about Fenwick & West, which is Terrence's law firm, the speaker of this webinar. We'll provide background about what his law firm provides to the community. And then we're going to get really into the details. We're going to talk about the different types of entities that you may want to select including a sole proprietorship, general partnership, LLC, C corporation, and S corporation. We're going to end with a summary and some key considerations for you to think about. And then we're going to talk about general steps for business formation. And then questions. Questions are at the end of this slide, but please feel free to put questions into the Q&A. The Q&A box is at the bottom of your screen. Please use that. We'll be monitoring it if you have questions along the way. Next slide, please. All right, who is ICLS? ICLS was founded in 1958. We are a nonprofit legal services organization serving Riverside and San Bernardino counties. On the right, I'm going to be very brief because I really want to leave time for our presenter. But I'm going to be very brief. I wanted to highlight all of the other types of legal services that we provide to the community. Just take a look at it and see, because if you or anyone you know is in need of these other legal services, please, please, please reach out to us. Everyone who attends today's webinar is going to get an email from Kayla or myself that has our contact information. So if you want to contact us to ask about how we can help your small business more, please reach out to us. But if you also have a question about tax or a question about public benefits or anything else, please feel free to reach out to us and we can try to connect you with the attorney in our organization to see if they are able to assist. Okay, now on to the main part of the show. Fenwick & West is the law firm of the speaker of today's webinar. The speaker is Terrence D'Souza. He is an attorney at Fenwick & West, which is honestly one of the best law firms in the country. I'm not just saying that because they're a critical partner with ICLS, but Fenwick & West has hundreds of attorneys that provide very complex legal guidance to some of the largest companies in the world. And over the past several decades, they have worked on some of the most complex, interesting legal matters available in the country. Terrence graduated law school in 2017 from UC Irvine School of Law. And since then, he's been concentrating his legal practice on helping companies on a wide range of corporate legal matters, helping clients with early formation issues, mergers, acquisitions, venture capital financing, and much, much more. I am so excited to hand it over now to Terrence to get started. He'll talk a little bit more about his law firm himself, and then he'll get into the subject of today's topic. Again, at the bottom of the screen, there is a question and answer tab. Please, please, please feel free to use it. We'll be monitoring it and we'll be addressing the questions as they come up. If you have a question that comes up later, please write it down and email me, and we'll try to help you get an answer to your question. With all of that, I'm going to hand it off to Terrence. Thank you very much for being here. And I will go on mute now. And thank you to the audience and everyone for being here as well.
Matt, thank you very much. Appreciate the introduction. Hello to everyone. I'll just say a little bit more about Fenwick & West. So Silicon Valley firm, we incorporated Apple, back in the day. The Facebook IPO was also part of Fenwick. Very full service from incorporation of the entity all the way to an exit event. And as you can tell here with this slide, we cover basically the full spectrum of what technology and life science companies look for when they incorporate, employee issues, antitrust litigation. And we do a little bit of everything there across a lot of different entity types and different types of companies. Matt, we can go on to the next one. And so the main focus here, of course, is the business entity selection, what to think about, what to be aware of. And as we kind of dive in here, as Matt said, feel free to type in your questions into the chat box below. We'll address whatever we can. If anything seems, outside the scope or we need to go track down something specific, we'll definitely reach out, but feel free to ask all your questions there and we'll do our best to get to all of them. So starting here, very high level, when you're thinking about forming a business and what you want to, keep in mind here is really three main things. How you're going to pay tax, because it's always going to come back, and how that's going to be dealt with. How do you want to deal with liability in terms of your personal liability? What assets are at risk? Is it just the company? Is it yourself individually? And what the goal is. Are you trying to raise money through a venture-backed company? Are you just trying to have a small business with no outside money? How do you want to transfer assets? You also want to think about where you want to form. That also plays a role, a Delaware corporation, a California corporation, or elsewhere. And those are kind of the three main things. Obviously, when you're dealing with the tax situation, we'll address it at a high level here, and there'll be specifics where you'll want to reach out to a tax accountant or specialist there. But we'll talk about these options with a variety of entities that you're likely considering or have thought about. So the first one here is a sole proprietorship, and this is not a legal entity. There's nothing that you file to form this entity. It's basically created by an individual, just one person, and it's the simplest structure. You just have to start forming or start your business. You're not filing anything. You're just carrying out whatever type of small business you have in mind. This doesn't separate you from the business. You are one and the same. Therefore, there's no personal liability protection. If you form a company, someone gets injured from a product you use or a service, they could come after you individually for your assets to cover whatever damages or claims they may be. So this one does carry a lot of risk if you do have some type of business that could have a claim, could have an issue, and you'll have to really think about that as you're kind of carrying out that business to prevent issues to your assets and your family's assets. So here, as we mentioned, no separate legal distinction. So that leads to very low cost. You don't really have to file anything. All the income, all of the losses will flow through from a tax perspective to your individual tax return, and you'll file it all in one place. There's no separate type of tax return or anything like that. There's no governance. You'll see with the more advanced companies, LLC, C Corp, S Corp, they'll be filing documents with the state. There'll be, with the C Corp, for example, you have to have bylaws, you have to have a charter. There'll be a lot more formal requirements for LLC operating agreement, which we'll all get into. And so here it's just very much you as an individual deciding how to run things with no distinction with the business. So as we kind of delve in a little bit more here, a sole proprietorship, there's no legal distinction here. You're not really selling the business. You can sell assets that you create as part of a transaction, but there is no transfer of a business. There's no really separate name or entity that's being sold or transferred to any individual. And if you want to dissolve this or you decide you don't want to deal with this type of business that you created, you essentially just stop renewing any type of licenses you might have. You'll basically just notify the IRS that anything related to this is closed. You'll stop reporting your tax returns, but there's nothing really to wrap up formally because it never really existed. So the advantages here, obviously, there's no state filing fees. There's not going to be any fees to, Delaware, wherever else you're doing business, because there's no formal registration of this business. You have sole control. You don't answer to anyone else within the business. It's just you as an individual. But the downside, of course, is the liability aspect. If you enter into contracts, you can't fulfill those contracts. People who have, you lend, they came after you for loans that you signed, they can come after you personally. And so they'll come after your assets, your house, whatever else you may have to satisfy that debt. When you have the entity set up, that will be prevented because they can't come after you personally, barring, a few exceptions that we can talk about. But that's something to very much keep in mind. How much of a risk do you want to pose to your personal assets? And essentially here, if you're not really concerned about liability, there's very minimal options available, or you might be able to get great insurance to cover any issues that you have. It's something to think about going forward as you kind of start a business and how you see things progressing.
Terrence,
yes, Matt.
One thing that happens, or we see a lot of clients who ask us whether they can start as a sole proprietorship and then go to an LLC or go to a general partnership or something. Like, how easy would you say is it to transfer between different entities?
So in terms of transferring from a sole proprietorship, you decide you want to morph into a general partnership. The general partnership, it's very easy. So in terms of transferring, the general partnership just essentially becomes two people instead of one. It's the same kind of risk that we'll talk about here with liability. In terms of transferring to an LLC, it's still very simple in terms of documentation with the state. You file a very simple registration form with the state registering your entity. You have the name reserved, you create an operating agreement. There are some formalities in terms of documentation, but you can go simplistic depending on how big or small that you're going to have of a business there. But it's not something that you can say, oh, I started as a sole proprietorship, I can never transition. You can always transition. There's always options for you to morph your business into a different structure.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thanks.
So starting here, as we move on from sole proprietorship to a general partnership, this essentially has the same concepts, but there's going to be 2 or more people. And it's you and a friend, you and your spouse, you decide to create a business, and you don't have any kind of formal, written agreement. It might not be intent, but you're trying to run some type of business essentially for profit. And so for this type of entity, each person is contributing their time, their labor, their skills. You'll share equally in the profits and losses. You're not filing anything with any type of state entity. It's recommended, though, of course, if you're doing this, it's inevitable that there's going to be disputes. You and your partner in this business might have arguments. There could be a bad type of situation down the road where you no longer want to continue. And if you don't have a written agreement about what happens in such a situation, it could create a messy type of breakaway from that business in terms of who's going to take the percentage of what's left and how you're dividing things. And so the type of terms that you want to include at a minimum, who owns what? Who's going to have 70-30? You can base that off of who's putting in more money or who is putting in more time. That's an agreement between the 2 of you as you kind of dive into what type of business and what makes sense. How you'd resolve disputes. You want to kind of think about, it's more complex, but something to think about arbitration, mediation. Those are much less expensive options that if something were to happen in a serious manner and there was a dispute, going to court and all that, it would prevent fees down the road in terms of that. Who has maybe more authority? Is it equal? How do you deal with if someone wants to leave the partnership and kind of the general issues with the business and how it would operate? So these are all things to think about at a high level to be able to document at least the big picture items. So on a day-to-day, there's no confusion. And in the worst case, when things are no longer amicable between the parties, you have a document that kind of details out what steps should be taken.
I'm going to pause you right there also, Terrence, because we do have a question from the audience about partnership agreements. There's 2 parts. The first part is, can you use a template for the partnership agreement? So just kind of about template partnership agreements, pros and cons. And also, does the partnership agreement have to be registered or filed with anyone?
So you can use a template. They do exist. It all depends, the quality of the template, where you're getting it from. I know organizations that provide such templates on basic terms, and they're all customizable. So it's not a problem there. Just more about finding out where you're getting it from and who's providing it, and nothing that needs to be registered. So you're not filing this with the California Secretary of State or anything. All the types of tax issues here are just passing through to your individual tax return. You're not paying an annual fee or anything like that. So nothing like that with a governmental entity.
I'll just add, so I can plug our services also. That's exactly what we tell everyone who comes to us with templates. Like, templates can be great depending on where it's from and depending on if it's applicable to what you're trying to do. They can also be terrible. Sometimes we've had clients come to us with templates that they found online that are specific to a specific state or specific industry that's not applying to what they're doing. So one of the things that we help people with during our one-on-one consultations is we help people review template agreements, draft agreements, and if helpful and necessary, and our volunteer attorneys are available, they'll actually help draft or revise or propose revised language to template agreements. So if you have questions, Nathan, or anyone else who's in the audience about a template agreement that you're using for this or other purpose, please feel free to reach out and see if we're able to help more.
Okay, great. And then we can move on to the next slide.
This was the next slide. Do you want me to move on to the next one?
Yes, the next one's fine.
Okay, cool.
Thank you, Kayla. So here, one thing to consider when you think about transferring assets, how that's going to be done, you're going to want to detail that as we talked about in this, partnership agreement. Usually, both partners want to consent to that. And then so it's something that you'll want to think about because one partner may want to transfer, they may want to get out. There might be some type of, someone wants to buy something. So it'll be something to think about how such a situation would unfold, and you want to make sure you're protecting yourself if that situation comes up with your partner. And in terms of the debt and all types of liabilities, if a partnership does dissolve, you'll have to think about how that's going to be paid, what the split is from the business. You want to think about who's going to pay what because those debts won't just automatically go away. And so it's better to think about ahead of time. So it's written, it's organized, and you'll have kind of a default in the worst case this partnership does dissolve. You no longer want to carry out the business. But there are, either debts or liabilities to vendors, to customers that might need to be paid back or anything along those lines. And whatever is left, if there is any assets, how it's going to be distributed to you, as we mentioned, in terms of the division of profit. So the advantages and disadvantages here is that you're going to be able to claim, all this on your personal tax returns. It's the same type of issue as a sole proprietorship in terms of advantages, though. It's very simple. You're not carrying out any type of formal registration. It's, inexpensive along the same lines of that. The same kind of downsides, you're personally liable for business debts, any lawsuits that come up. Even by your partner, they sue you for something. It's the same concept here. You're still going to be personally liable. And you'll also want to think about who you're entering into business with for the concept of what they can basically bind you to do. So they go out, they commit to some type of loan or some type of transaction, and they have the authority to do so, and they can bind the whole partnership to that agreement. And so that becomes an issue of trust because you want to make sure whoever you're in business with understands that. The problem becomes, of course, if they sign up for something you didn't know, you're still personally liable because it could come back to you. And so that's something to also think about because you want to make sure you're protecting your individual assets at the end of the day. Same kind of issues here. If you have, minimal liabilities, you might be able to get insurance protecting certain things. Do have multiple owners, it might be a low risk from that liability perspective. It's something to think about in terms of if you decide to go with this at first, just to see, what's happening with your business. But if any of these, fail to be true, you have a lot of liability, you can't get insurance, you definitely want to think about forming some type of entity to protect you as an individual. So the next one here is the first type of, legal entity that we're going to talk about, that where you actually file something, with the state. It's called an LLC. It's basically created by state statute. Each state usually has a different type of LLC statute with rules. It's basically the full name, limited liability company. There's tax efficiencies to it. It has some features of a corporation. It's flexible like a partnership, as we'll talk about in terms of the operating agreement, detailing things out. You can be a single member LLC, can be multiple members. It can be managed by the members, or what you can do is create a board of managers. Let's say you have, 5 members and you want only 2 people who maybe have the biggest chunk putting into the LLC to be on the board of managers. And they will, be in charge of day-to-day. You can name an officer of the LLC if you want as well. And so they'll be able to take care of that. And then within the LLC, you're going to create basically the operating agreement. And that's essentially what we think of as the constitution of the LLC. And we can go on to the next slide. And so with the members, you're basically owning a stake of the LLC. And what that means is it's usually something called units. And I've seen people define this however many ways: common units, class A units, class B units. It just kind of depends what type of rights they want to give to each type of unit. Class A could be the people who created it. They have, extra voting rights. It just kind of depends. You can kind of decide what optimal structure you want. It could be based on who put in more. Class A put in 80%, Class B only put in 10, Class C put in the other 10, or you can just have one straight class and you can kind of define it. But at a high level, you're talking about profits and losses, how they're going to be allocated. And as we mentioned, who's managing it? Do all the members have to vote on everything? a certain percentage of members or just the unanimous, and in terms of what circumstances as well, what actions the LLC takes and who should vote in what situation. So you can customize this to a lot of different things depending on the type of business you're in and who you're in business with and the level of trust that's there as well. One thing to think about is also who can bind you to deals. And so you'll have to think about any member of the LLC, if they have, authority, they'll be seen as being able to bind you to deals. There's a very tricky thing. You'll have to tell this counterparty they don't have the authority to do so. And it's something that can come up, but it's something to think about still, that if that person is representing themselves as a member and the agreement allows, there's no distinction between a board of managers or anything else, there could be this argument they could bind you to deals. So something to think about in terms of protection. The advantage here, of course, is there is personal liability protection. So something were to happen in a very worst case scenario, they wouldn't be coming after your assets personally in something like that. And as I mentioned previously, you can have officers appointed, a CEO, a president, a secretary, and they can kind of run the day-to-day if that's how you choose to do it.
I'll put a pause real quick because we have a couple questions, which makes sense because LLCs are a very common entity for a lot of the business. The first question comes from Deborah Price Jackson, one of the audience members, and she asks, if you are a single member LLC, do you still need an operating agreement?
Yes, you should definitely have an operating agreement in any circumstance, single member or whatever the case may be. You still want a very clear document because this is a formal legal entity. You want to make sure you're taking the minimal steps at least to show that, you're filing with the state, you have an operating agreement that governs the guidelines. The worst case scenario here is what something here on this slide actually called piercing the corporate veil, is you create this entity, it's LLC, but you don't treat it as the separate entity, and you're combining assets personally with yourself and your personal bank accounts and the LLC bank accounts, and there's no division. When you create this type of LLC, you're formally creating basically a separate company. It's separate and apart from you as an individual. So you want to make sure you have that operating agreement, because if worst comes to worst, something happens, someone comes after you, they can say, hey, they didn't follow the guidelines, and so we're going to go after them personally because they just created this as kind of a shell. They didn't care. And so it's still something you want to do at a very basic level of having an operating agreement.
Thank you. That cannot be highlighted enough. If you're operating an LLC, you don't get protections under all circumstances. You have to make sure you're complying, you're complying with corporate formalities. Thank you, Terrence. The next question is from Nita Varma, another audience member. Can you elaborate a little bit on the tax efficiencies that are gained operating a business as an LLC versus a sole proprietorship?
Yeah, so in terms of the sole proprietorship and the general partnership, so those are going to be all, pass through. And so the LLC, they have a couple options for tax. So one is they flow through to the members from the incomes earned, any losses that happened. And so you can think of it as you tax as a partnership there. You can also think about taxing as a corporation. And this is called kind of a check the box election. You decide as a corporation, you don't want to be taxed directly. So basically you'll have two levels of tax, one at the LLC level, and then one coming at the individual level. And so you'll be subject to the double taxation. And so this will kind of depend on the personal, circumstances of each business and your personal income tax returns and whatnot, where you'll have to decide what might be a better option for you. But it does open the options to you to decide what might work better, where you could get benefits, deductions, and whatnot in terms of the go forward. And you can always change this. You can decide, hey, I'm going to start out with pass through. We're going to go through that level, or in the future, the business grows, you think a C Corp election is better, and you can decide that as well in the future.
Thank you. We actually have another question, and this might be a little too detailed, but I'll send it to Terrence. And the question is, if you file your LLC in Nevada, are you subject to the California franchise tax? I think assuming that your LLC is in Nevada, but you're operating your business in California.
Yeah, so you want to be careful of whatever state you're operating, regardless of whether you filed the entity there. because all these states, either C corps, LLCs, you'll file in one state. So a lot of the companies I see, they're Delaware C corps, but they're operating businesses in California. And so vice versa for LLCs, Delaware LLCs, you have to register as a foreign qualification if you have usually substantial contact or some contact. So if you're conducting a lot of business in California, but you're registered in Nevada, you'll need to pay very close attention to the qualification rules. And they're usually broken down by statute. So it's a very case by case kind of basis, depending on the state. But that's something to really think about, because if you operate in a state where you're required to qualify as a foreign entity, but you fail to do so, they could come after you for penalties. And they could come after you for since inception. So let's say you started the business today, you didn't qualify in California, you were just only in Nevada where you registered. And 3 years later, you realize, oh, I need to do this. The business is bigger. Certain vendors or lenders or whoever the case may be are asking me to do this. They could come back to you and say, how long has this been going on? They'll ask on the form typically. With Illinois, it's a major problem that I've seen. They come after you for a lot of penalties. So case by case, but you should always think about, if I'm doing business in a foreign state, I may have to register and pay the fees accordingly as a foreign entity.
I'll just add, as far as ICLS can help, this is a pretty specific issue. I think what Terrence says is exactly correct, but there's a lot of factors that might play into it. So if you are looking for more guidance, please feel free to apply for our further services, because we might be able to connect you with an attorney that could look into the specific issue for your business or other issues like this. Thank you, Terrence, for that question and answering all the questions. I think we're at a pause on questions for now, so please continue, and thank you for answering as we go.
Great, no problem at all. Thanks for the good questions. Just last thing on the slide, I'll just reference here, because I know obviously a lot of you or most of you are based in California. There's going to be fees to the state here if you form an LLC. There's an annual fee of $800. There are other little forms, statement of information, that have to be filed as well. So there's different types of forms here and payments that you'll want to track. You should obviously get reminders as you form. They'll ask for them, but it's something to keep in mind. There will be annual fees. There will be some forms every other year that you'll have to fill out as well. And if you don't, what usually happens is you'll fall out of good standing. And it's something that can be easily rectified if it's taken care of within a certain period of time. If it's something that lapses for a long time, then it becomes a problem of the period of several years or something like that. But it gets more detailed as the situation unfolds. Okay, I think we can move on to the next slide. So the first step here, when you want to file, it's usually a very simple, one pager. It's not very complex. You can Google the form, the LLC one, and there's usually instructions here on how to fill it out, what to include, things that it asks for, obviously the name, the purpose, how it's going to be managed, address. One thing to think about is the registered agent. And so you can either usually have yourself, because you're the sole member, or just one of the members, or you can hire an entity. And I see that happen with bigger LLCs. They're kind of further down the line, so they can't be managing on a day-to-day basis. And the purpose of that is just so if there's any notices, suits, claims, it has to go to someone, and every state will require some type of registered agent to make sure the business can be essentially contacted. And if you're forming outside of California, each state kind of has its own process, but it's relatively simple in terms of the document that's actually filed with the specific Secretary of State. The operating agreement that we've kind of talked about here is not filed with the Secretary of State. It's a personal document to the LLC that's all its members and managers, however you form, can see it. And we'll talk about, everything we've kind of mentioned: profits, losses, cash flow, governance, election, voting procedures. And it doesn't have to include all those, of course. It can include as much or as little as you want. It's obviously good to include the big core features of voting, if you're going to have manager, member managed, any type of dissolving issues, who's going to get what, how things are going to be dealt with, if someone wants to transfer. So kind of the big picture items should be addressed, and then it can be customized however you kind of like to a large degree. So in terms of transferring assets, it's something that you can do depending if there's no restrictions in the agreement, of course. You might want to insert that because maybe you think someone might transfer a significant piece. They could have transfer their rights. You don't want some other person to get that advantage. You can also buy out someone who's looking to leave. That's something that does happen. And that kind of will be an agreement between the person that is leaving and the rest of the members. You can transfer the LLC. If you're going to dissolve it, there are formal procedures here. So unlike a sole proprietorship, unlike a general partnership, because you actually filed this, legal document stating this is a separate entity, if you do dissolve it, there's something you do have to file with the California Secretary of State or other Secretary of States, depending on where you qualify to do business or where you formed initially. And so the process will kind of depend on the state. And it will also depend on the voting rights in the agreement, whether it's unanimous, whether it's, a majority, and that kind of the language that you put in there. And also you'll have to think about, the type of contracts you still have in place with debtors, with people you're in business with, how that's going to be wrapped up, how those debts will be paid off, or, how to deal with that. So something to think about if you do choose to dissolve it at some point. So the biggest advantage here is, or one of the biggest is the liability aspect. So now you're protecting your personal assets. You're going to be able to separate that as long as as we talked about, you make sure you respect that corporate formality, that the LLC is a separate entity, that you're treating it as such. You have its own bank account. You're not transferring money freely between your personal and the LLC or anything like that. So you'll have that kind of personal liability protection as long as the corporate formalities are being followed. You can kind of decide how the profits and losses are going to be allocated. And you have freedom to create a single member LLC. So it can just be you as well. And you can have that protection. You do need to keep in mind, though, here when you have this LLC entity, if you don't follow, of course, the formalities, they can come after you personally. You want to make sure who can still bind you to a contract. So that's something to think about. You do have the annual requirements, like we talked about, that you'll have to keep up with, and the fees and whatnot. So those are things that will still come up and you'll have to track. And it's something to think about because you definitely want the protection of the entity. And if single or multiple owners here, however you want to structure it, it's something to also think about. In terms of the advantage of the LLC, you're not going to see this with companies that are looking to raise kind of venture money per se. Long term, they might convert to a C corp, which we can talk about. It's kind of a different circumstance here. But it's a company, usually a small business. They're not looking to raise a lot of outside investors in terms of that structure of venture money that you might hear about a lot in Silicon Valley. So that's more of like a bigger picture issue, depending on the type of business you're looking to run with and eventually turn into. So here we kind of get to what I deal with a lot, C corporations. So these are kind of the most common entity that I'm dealing with. Tech companies form as C corps, life science companies form as C corps. You're basically creating a separate legal entity. It's owned by shareholders, those who are investing in the business, founders, early employees. They're issued stock. They have then the rights over certain actions and they have to vote on certain things. You're going to pay tax here, which we'll get into kind of on two levels, at the entity and then at the individual level if dividends or anything are distributed. So it's this is the most common if you are thinking of having a venture-backed company and you want those types of investors, because they're going to want this. They're not going to deal with anything else. Great, we can go to the next slide. And so the shareholders here are going to be a mix. So you can have entities, you can have individuals, you'll have kind of two structures. You'll have common stock, which is employees, founders. You'll have preferred stock, which is all the investors. This is the difference between those two in any type of sale, liquidation event, exit. The preferred is going to get a benefit. They get paid out first ahead of the common. Debt is always supreme, so debt gets paid out at the very top. But once you get into the stock itself, so that's something to think about. In terms of governance, you do have a formal board of directors. And these are elected by the shareholders, and this can be one person initially when you form, and then it will expand as you take on new investments and you want to increase the size of the board. And the board will basically have to rule on all the decisions. You execute what we call written consents that kind of detail actions. And then shareholders as well will need to approve other actions that are essential to the business. The big governing document here is the certificate of incorporation for C Corp. It's something that's filed with the state of Delaware usually because we deal with Delaware C Corps, but you can form obviously C Corps in other states. Delaware is just the most common because it has the most robust corporate law. So investors only want you to be in Delaware. And if you're not, they'll make you convert to a Delaware C Corp. And so you can't kind of get away from it. The limited liability is the same here. You're not going to be liable for losses and debts, personally. The corporation's going to be the liable entity, so you'll kind of just lose what you've put in. There is also a situation, though, same piercing the corporate veil. If there's an abuse here, they could still try to come after you. The corporation's not respecting the formalities. There's, shifting of money here and there. You could have some major problems, and you might have seen something like this with the FTX scandal that came out not too long ago, a few months ago. So you always want to make sure you're respecting the corporate formalities when you create a formal legal entity. In terms of tax, you're going to have two types of tax. So the C Corp itself is going to pay tax on its earnings. And then if anything is distributed, you'll pay that as a shareholder of the company. And so if you have if you're forming California, there's an annual tax. Every state's going to have it. Delaware, California, and the tax here, it may be higher than others, but there's different opportunities here because you're going to get a lot of different types of investors for C Corps. And the goal everyone has with the C Corp, which is why you form it, is you want to take this public, and that's some big ideal everyone has, or you want to sell off the company. But that's kind of the end games for these two. So C Corp is obviously, the separate entities we talked about. We talked about how you file it with the Secretary of State. It's kind of a very simple process. It can be it's a short one pager. It'll just kind of state the bare minimum, how many shares, address, location. Because this is kind of the most used entity in a lot of ways, there are a lot of administrative fees you might have to think about here, annual taxes, reports that have to be filed with Delaware or other states. So you'll want to kind of get a sense of that and to make sure you can account for it. And then on a basis of actually governing the company, you kind of have the charter, of course, that we talked about. You have bylaws, which are the rules, how to call meetings, how to deal with officers and directors, different types of rules. The charter is, essentially the Constitution, and then you have the bylaws that govern sort of other assets, but the bylaws can't conflict. And so things to think about, there are more just formal governance items in place for this that you'll want to think about before you get started, just so you know what you're getting into. But it's something that there's a lot of templates for, just like, that question came up before, but obviously it depends where you get those templates and to make sure it covers what you need. So the issue here with transferability is you can transfer your stock in a C Corp. There are going to be a lot of restrictions. So if you're, a founder of the company, the investors aren't going to want you to freely transfer. And so there's going to be a lot of restrictions in the agreements. If you hold more than 1% of the stock of the company, essentially, you're going to have restrictions by the investors because they don't want you just to transfer large amounts of stock. They're going to want the right to get them first from you. But you are allowed to sell. There's a lot more securities issues here because private companies, you can't just usually freely sell securities. There has to be an exemption to registration under the Securities Act of like 1934. Things you don't have to think about now, but things to just keep in mind where yes, it's easier to transfer in terms of if you want to transfer to your trust, a family member, and that kind of thing. And it's still possible to transfer and sell. It'll just depend on the very specific agreements that come into place, with your investors of the company and how you decide to structure that. They'll come in with standard terms and you'll kind of have to see how to get around that. In terms of dissolving, we've dissolved a lot, unfortunately, in the last year, I think, with the market. And so it is a multi-step process. You're going to file. So usually we're dealing with Delaware C Corp. So you have to dissolve in Delaware. You have to surrender a certificate of surrender in California. And then you're going to have the board and stockholders sign kind of the formal documentation that we talked about to say the company is going to be dissolving and whatnot. And you have to provide the actual certificate. You'll get the filed evidence with creditors, so they know what's happening, with the bank. We have an account and whatnot. So it's a multi-step process to dissolve, but it's not super complicated if it needs to happen. The one thing to think about though, if you do have a lot of money outstanding, we had one that had 14 million, but they had 13 million in debt, and then so they would just they had to go under because of some other things. And there's going to be, based on the charter that you create, how that money is distributed, and it has to be done properly to make sure people are getting their percentage of whatever's left. So, the advantages here, if you're looking to do a venture-backed company and that's your goal, this is it. You could start with an LLC and you can convert to a C Corp. That does happen. It's common, but usually people just end up starting with C Corps. You have the limited liability, with the exception of if you're using kind of the corporate formalities. So things to keep in mind there. You're going to have to think about securities law on some aspect when you issue stock, even to a founder. In your founder, you're in California, you still have to file with the Secretary of State different documents. So in California, it's a 25102F filing. There's a lot of requirements that you need to think about. If you have employees, eventually you create an equity incentive plan. Even if you're 5 employees you just formed 2 months ago, there's things to file. So even if you're very early stage, you don't have any money in the bank yet, you still have to file these certain documents. And if you don't, the state will come with you at fines. So for example, you have this plan, because you probably heard the term, options. It's something an employee gets to be able to purchase stock in the company on a future basis. If you don't file a specific form in California, they'll come after you for a $3,000 fine. And so just things to think about in terms of the administrative issues. You just kind of want to get your head around it a little bit to make sure you're not taking steps that open yourself up to all these various fines, and then you're kind of in the hole early on. So as we talked about, this is kind of good for you try to scale a company and you want kind of venture-backed investments with that limited liability protection. This is kind of the business for you. So an S Corp, it's going to be a different type of entity. It's something that you don't see a lot of at Fenwick, because we're dealing with more LLCs and C Corps, but it's not a distinct legal entity. It's a different status you're going to get under tax law. And there's different requirements here. The amount of shareholders, who can be a shareholder, only one class of stock. So there's a lot more restrictions. And so entities, obviously, they're not going to want to invest in this if you're looking to get outside money. There's just more things. There's issues with citizenship, being a US citizen and investing. And so those are kind of big picture things to think about, depending on what type of business, who you're looking to get money from, if that's something you're thinking about. All of the profits will get passed through to the shareholders who individually file their personal income tax returns. So that's something to think about too, with the kind of the pass through there. And so, like we talked about here, the requirements of essentially being a US citizen, not being an entity, not having more than a set number of shareholders. The company can't, go public, you're not publicly traded. So there's just right off the bat, a lot more restrictions about what could happen. But you do have the same personal liability protections. You're not going to be liable unless there's issues with kind of, piercing the corporate veil, like we've been kind of talking about. And so the main difference, you see S Corp, you see C Corp. The C Corp is double taxed. The S Corp is not double taxed. And so that's something to think about. There's going to be fees, like we talked about in California, wherever else you form, about the annual tax fees and how you want to deal with it there. There's also going to be, with general tax, you kind of talk to your accountant if you have an S Corp, typically about how the taxes are going to flow through to your individual returns, and how that would impact you personally, and how that would impact your fees going down the line, whether this makes sense or not. And so in terms of the governing requirements, same kind of concept here where you're going to want separate records, separate bank accounts. You're going to have, in terms of the formation, it's usually something, a one pager you submit to the IRS. It's kind of less formal in that sense. Assets can be transferred depending on the, what's happening there. There are different regulations for an S corp. And the dissolution is kind of similar, filing something with the IRS, kind of letting them know. So different kind of rules here in governance. It's more relaxed than a C corp. You might not have as much documentation to deal with, of course. I've seen some S corps that are very just basically a small business. They don't deal with all these bylaws and all this type of thing. It's still good to have, obviously, documentation, the minimal, but it's not as much of an administrative burden as a C corp in terms of what will be required on an annual basis. So the advantages here is that the single taxation. C corps, you're going to have the double taxation, and so something to think about depending on your specific situation. In terms of the economic rights, the disadvantages, of course, it has to be an individual. There have to be kind of U.S. citizens here. So things you want to think about in terms of the future of your company and what you think might happen. You can't have varying rights. So like the C corp, for example, you have common stock, you have preferred stock, you have different rights, different voting. This is all going to be the same for an S corp. Everyone's kind of on the same footing. So there is something to be said there, depending on who you want to bring in. No one's going to invest in terms of a venture-backed company in an S corp. It's just not done. And I haven't really seen many S corp conversions and this and that. So it's something you want to think about if you're trying to get that kind of scope of a business venture backed and stuff. The S corp starting out that way would be a hard way to go to transition. So that could be the only thing where I would very much think about ahead of time if what your overall goal is, and if you do start an S corp first.
We have two quick questions. One of them relates to the summary. The first question is, do you know the name of an example S corp? The person just wants to get an idea of what kind of businesses benefit from this type. I will say that we have helped an HVAC business in the area with developing an S corp. So I know that's one business. But Terrence, I don't know if you have any other things out there.
I've dealt with a few. It's very much a small business. This one was a software developer. They only basically had 3 employees. They decided tax purposes it made more sense to file as an S corp. They weren't looking to kind of get any type of venture backed money or anything like that. They very much wanted to keep it a small mom and pop shop kind of business, and so that was an example I've seen recently.
Yeah. And then the next question, as we're moving into the kind of summary and ending, the question is, sounds like a sole proprietorship LLC are the only structures that do not require stockholders. Is that true?
So the S corp, you don't need to have stockholders. The one that we were dealing with did not. It was essentially this one person kind of running it. So you can kind of customize that structure. LLC, yes, it can be single members. You don't need it. Sole proprietorship and general partnership. I mean, you're not going to have stockholders per se. You're not creating any type of stock or anything like that. So there are other ones that don't require stockholders where you can still have control.
Great, thank you. And I'm mindful that we're nearing the end of our time, so I'll take a pause from questions right now.
Okay, sounds good. So just kind of the summary here that we kind of started up with up front. You always want to think about your personal liability protection, the tax of what you're trying to create, how that's going to come back to you, and the cost, because you're going to have all 3 of these things kind of rotating. In terms of liability, you want to protect yourself personally. At the end of the day, it's not just yourself, it's your family. You don't want to create some business that's going to have liability as a sole proprietorship or a general partnership where they come after you personally and they take all your assets. So that's always something that you want to think about. And if you do decide to form an entity, you need to remember to respect the corporate formalities, respect the separate entity, the separate bank account, and that type of structure to ensure that if there is an issue down the line, someone does sue the company, you are protected individually because they can say, hey, this person X followed all the formalities and there's no issues. The tax level is something that you're going to kind of think about more depending on your situation, consulting with a tax advisor for the different types of options. So sole proprietorship, general partnership that's going to be coming to you, the pass through, C Corp, the double taxation, LLCs can go both. So it'll kind of just depend on what works for you and what kind of be the benefit. But there are annual tax fees for C Corps, for LLCs that you need to keep in mind. And just general costs for running a business. C Corps are going to have the most. It's going to be annual taxes. It's going to be securities filings. There's going to be a lot of different forms here and there that you need to kind of have a handle on of what's coming up. Same with LLCs. There are still, administrative fees here and there. Any type of legal entity is going to have some, and it's something just to know what could be that worst case outcome annually, just so you kind of have a ballpark. And so in terms of ownership, so LLCs, C Corps, very flexible. LLCs, you can, customize kind of how you want. C Corps, you do see some strange things. You probably heard of people trying to get 10-to-1 voting stock, and that does happen. You've seen it once or twice. So kind of customizable. You can make it flexible as your situation. S Corps, more restrictions, of course, that you need to think about in terms of who can be a shareholder, the max, and kind of how to deal with the economics, because there everyone's kind of on the same page. There's no differentiation of rights. In terms of governance, LLCs can be kind of simple here with the operating agreement. You still need one, of course, but can be very customizable. If something is not addressed, I should mention, in an LLC operating agreement, each state, because they have LLC statutes, there are default rules. And so you'll see that if it's not covered, it'll say this rule will govern. So it'll be a majority of the vote or whatever it is. So something to think about. There are default rules that can protect in certain situations. C Corps, obviously the most. You have to have the bylaws. You're going to have all this documentation with the board, the shareholders. So things to think about there, because as a C Corp, if you're not having the board do things, you're not having shareholders do things, complying with the state you're in, you're going to have this possibly piercing the corporate veil issue where they're going to see it kind of as a shell where you're not really respecting the formalities. And Delaware in general is more expensive. And if you're, if for the reason of what we talked about, it's more robust. So they have a more robust corporate legal scheme that's been developed for decades now. And so all these entities, you'll probably see a ton of them if you go to the website, say Delaware C Corp. And so it's just because of the robust legal scheme. If something does happen, they have the most law on it, and it's very favorable to companies. So that's why entities love to form there. But it comes with an expense side of it. There might be more fees, especially if you're going to operate in California. You would have to form in Delaware, qualify in California. Now you're dealing with both states in terms of taxes and fees and all that. So something to think about. Even if you might get benefit from the robust corporate law, it might be easier just to stay in California if you're only going to operate in California. And just another thing to think about here is if you operate in a state and form in that state, but then your business expands to other states, as we kind of talked about, and Matt mentioned, very factor intensive if you have to qualify in another state, and something to definitely reach out to ICLS about. And so, just to kind of summarize here, you have a lot of different options. You're not tied to one in particular. It all depends on the circumstances of what situation you're looking to with your business. Obviously we talked about the no liability protection, sole proprietorship, but maybe you don't have any risk, or you have great insurance that you can get. Or if you're a venture-backed company, that's your goal, you have to do a C Corp. So there's different risks here, different levels, depending on what you're trying to do as a small business, or if your goal is to become a bigger business. But things to kind of think about and keep in mind as you kind of decide how you want to approach things. Great. Was that it on the slides? Was there?
Yeah, the next few slides provide
got it.
guidance on steps for forming certain business entities. I think given that we're at time, we can stop here. We will circulate the slides to everyone Terrence, if you have time to go through them, please feel free. But we can also stop here and then ask everyone who attends if they have questions, just to reach out to us, and then we can help them through the business formation process if they're eligible.
Sure. If there's one or two more questions in the chat, happy to answer those. And then the slides at the back end kind of just talk about how to form and things to keep in mind. So definitely things to read through as you decide, how to form your entity.
Great. Comment in the chat that says, thank you very much. Very insightful. Thank you, James, for that comment. And thank you, Terrence, for being very insightful and providing all this information. I'll give it another minute or two to see if anyone else has any other questions. Please feel free to add them. In the meantime, you'll see that I added into the chat, hopefully you'll be able to see it, a link to our application to apply for more extended legal services for your small business. Feel free to fill that out. If you do, Kayla and/or I will reach out with more information. Please note there are eligibility screening requirements for that service. Seeing no further questions, I think I'm going to end the webinar. Thank you so much, Terrence, for joining us today. I will say I thought it was very insightful, very clear, very helpful. Really appreciate you being here. Really appreciate you not only doing this, but also helping some of our small business owners on other projects and other clinics. I'll let you maybe give the last kind of conclusion if you have any thoughts to give, and then we'll wrap up.
No problem. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Kayla. Really appreciate you having me on here. It was great, being able to lead this webinar and talk about so many different types of small business issues. I know a lot of people, small business is kind of the way to kind of personal freedom, and it's something to really think about as you explore opportunities. So glad I had the chance to kind of to walk through these things. And as you kind of go and think about these things with your own business and how you want to structure things, definitely think about, what your goal is, how you want to form the administrative things, because you want to get ahead of things before creating some type of entity or some type of sole proprietorship that could lead to liability. So thank you all for your time, and really appreciate it.